I was thinking recently about up at the idea of the sidekick.
Oh, go.
In history, in stories, even in the Bible, we tend to put all of our focus on the main character. You have the hero in the spotlight, and then you have the person standing just off to the side, usually in the shadows.
It's a very common way to tell a story. The sidekick is there for support, maybe to handle the day-to-day things while the hero gets the big moments.
Exactly. And when you look at the Exodus story, Moses he's a titan. He's the one to burning bush. He's the lawgiver. He's holding the staff at the Red Sea.
Right.
And standing right there next to him is his brother Aaron. And I feel like for most of us, Aaron is just Moses' brother.
That, or if people do remember him for something specific, it's usually for his absolute worst day.
The golden calf.
The golden calf, it's the one thing that sticks.
Yeah, the classic Sunday school disaster story.
Yeah.
But we have this essay in front of us by Brother Woody Brum that, well, it suggests that if we leave it there, we are missing the entire point.
A huge point.
The argument here is that if we only see Aaron as a sidekick or as the guy who messed up with the idol, we're missing this profound theological picture, a blueprint for how sinful people can even relate to a holy God.
It's a massive oversight. And Brum's essay, it really anchors this whole deep dive in a specific duality. He uses 2 words to define Aaron's life: gift and gravity.
I wanted to stop on that because gift makes perfect sense. He was given this incredible honor, this position. But gravity, that usually makes me think of physics or, a very serious mood. What does the author mean by pairing those two?
Think of gravity here in the sense of weight, of heaviness. It's interesting, the Hebrew word for glory, kabod, it literally means heavy.
Oh, wow.
So the thesis of the essay is that God gave Aaron a gift, the high priesthood, the access, the beautiful garments. But with that gift came a crushing gravity. It's the weight of holiness.
So the closer you get to God,
Yeah.
the heavier the atmosphere becomes, spiritually speaking.
Yeah, precisely. That's the central idea. Drawing near to the Holy One requires treating him as holy. You cannot just wander into his presence casually. There is a density, a weightiness to his presence. And if you treat it lightly, well, the consequences are severe.
So Aaron's life is basically a case study.
It's a perfect case study in what happens when you carry that weight well and the tragic consequences of what happens when your knees buckle under it.
That completely reframes the whole discussion. This isn't just a biography of an ancient figure. It sounds more like a manual on proximity to God.
And that is exactly why it matters so much to you listening today. You might not be wearing a breastpiece with 12 stones on it or sacrificing bulls, but that tension.
What tension?
The tension between the incredible gift of knowing God and the immense gravity of who he actually is. That is the central struggle of the Christian life. We're looking at Aaron to understand how God uses deeply, deeply imperfect servants, and ultimately to prepare our hearts for why we needed a better high priest than Aaron ever could be.
Okay, so let's get into that. Let's start with the historical background. Before the robes and the incense, who was this man? Because the essay points out he had a whole life, an 80-year life, before Moses even came back from the desert.
We have to go back to the mud and the brick pits of Egypt. Aaron was born into bondage, total slavery. He was from the tribe of Levi, the son of Amram and Jochebed. But here's the detail we so often gloss over. Aaron was the big brother.
Right. 3 years older than Moses.
3 years older. So think about what that means. When Moses was floating in a basket, or being raised in the luxury of the palace, or even when he fled to Midian for 40 years, Aaron was there.
He stayed. He was in the thick of it.
For 80 years, he lived under the whip of the Egyptian taskmasters. He saw the suffering of his people intimately day in and day out. The essay paints a really vivid picture of this environment, a people groaning under forced labor, but at the same time, this miracle is happening.
The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied.
Exactly. It was God's way of showing he hadn't forgotten the promise to Abraham, even when everything looked absolutely hopeless from a human perspective.
But we need to think about their spiritual life during this time. I think we take concepts like church or priest completely for granted, but before Aaron, that kind of formal structure, it just didn't exist.
It didn't. Not at all.
So if I'm an Israelite, say during the time of the patriarchs or even during the slavery in Egypt, how do I worship? What does my spiritual life look like on a Tuesday?
It looks like your backyard or your front yard. For centuries, we're talking from Abel to Noah, all the way to Job and Abraham worship was what the essay calls a household altar system. The head of the family, the father, he acted as the priest for his household.
Like Job getting up early to offer sacrifices for his children just in case they'd sinned.
That's the perfect example. It was local, it was simple, it was very small scale. You'd build them out of earth or find some stones, you'd offer a sacrifice, and you'd worship with your immediate family. But with the Exodus, the entire physics of the relationship changes.
How so?
God isn't just visiting a single family's tent anymore, like he did with Abraham. He is moving in. He is becoming the king who dwells in the center of a redeemed nation of, maybe 2 million people.
And these are people who have been soaking in Egyptian paganism and idolatry for 400 years. They're redeemed, but they are messy.
They are incredibly messy. And now you have a holy God, that gravity we talked about, dwelling right in the middle of a sinful, messy camp. The essay suggests a shift that I like to think of it with an analogy. It's like moving from a campfire to a nuclear reactor.
Okay, unpack that. A campfire it's cozy, it's warm.
A campfire is warm. It's safe. You can sit right next to it. You can cook on it. It's approachable. But a nuclear reactor, it has the power to light up an entire city. Immense energy. But if you walk into the core of that reactor without a containment suit, you are finished.
You're vaporized.
Instantly. The radiation, the holiness is too much for unprotected humanity to withstand.
So in this analogy, the tabernacle is the reactor core.
And the priesthood, with Aaron at its head, is the containment protocol. The high priest is the mediator. He's the man in the suit who ensures that the people can live near this holy God without being consumed by him.
Wow. That makes Aaron's calling sound significantly more terrifying than just wearing fancy clothes.
It was a matter of life and death for the whole nation, and his specific call reflects that seriousness. It happens, of course, at the burning bush. Moses is arguing with God, making excuses. I can't speak. I'm slow of speech.
And God's response is, what about your brother?
Yes. Is there not Aaron the Levite, your brother? And then God adds this key detail. I know that he speaks well.
Which tells us something. It implies that Aaron wasn't a nobody. He probably already had some status, some influence among the slaves in Egypt. He was articulate.
Yeah.
A leader in his own right.
I think that's right. God doesn't just pull him out of nowhere. He uses Aaron's natural gifts for his spiritual ends. And he knits these two brothers together in this fascinating partnership. Moses has the revelation. He carries the heavy burden of the mission. But Aaron has the voice. He's called to share that burden.
There's a contrast the essay mentions here that I find really powerful. The contrast between Egypt and God's methods.
Oh, yes.
Egypt reverenced power, spectacle, chariots, huge armies.
Right. Pharaoh projects his strength through massive stone monuments and military might. And what does God send against all that? 2 old men, one with a simple shepherd's staff and one with a voice.
It's designed to look weak.
Completely. It's designed to expose what false strength really is. It pits simple, humble obedience against the brute force of an empire.
So let's get into that partnership. The essay calls this section the mouth and the hand, which I love, because Aaron isn't just a passive mouthpiece.
No, not at all. We often attribute all the miracles to Moses in our memory, but if you read the text closely, it's very often Aaron who is physically executing them.
Like the staff turning into a serpent in front of Pharaoh.
Aaron threw it down. The first plague, the plague of blood. Aaron stretched out his hand with the staff over the waters of Egypt. The frogs. Aaron's hand again. He was the active agent of God's power.
I want to pause on the relational dynamic there because it's really something. Aaron is the older brother. In that culture, the firstborn, the older brother, is the one in charge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yet here he is taking direction from his younger brother who's been a fugitive shepherd for 40 years. I mean, that requires a profound humility.
It really does. It requires him to submit his natural ego, his cultural position, to God's spiritual ordering of things. He had to be willing to be the number 2 for the sake of God's mission. And we see that interdependence, that humility, maybe most clearly in the battle against the Amalekites at Rephidim.
This is one of my favorite images in the whole Old Testament. Moses on the hill, holding up the staff of God.
It's such a desperate scene. As long as Moses' hands are raised, Israel wins the battle down in the valley. But he's an 80-year-old man. His arms are burning. They're getting heavy. He's failing physically.
And if he fails, people die.
People die. So Aaron and another man, Hur, they step in. But they don't just, shout encouragement from the sidelines.
No, they get practical.
Very practical. They find a stone for him to sit on to give him some stability, and then they stand on either side of him and physically hold his hands up until the sun goes down.
It's such a beautiful picture of the church, really.
It is. Leadership is upheld by fellowship. You cannot do it alone. The victory for the entire nation depended on Aaron being willing to do the unglamorous work of supporting the weary hands of the leader God had chosen.
So that support role, that partnership, it leads us to the moment where the gift is fully realized. This is Leviticus chapters 8 and 9, the ordination.
This is the absolute peak, the high point of his life. The tabernacle is finally built. Now the man who will serve in it must be prepared.
And it's not a quick ceremony.
No, it's a 7-day process. It's methodical. It's sacred. They wash him with water, a symbol of purification. They anoint him with this special oil. They put on these magnificent garments that the text says are for dignity and honor.
And on the turban, right on his forehead, is that golden plate.
Holy to the Lord. It's like a billboard on his head, a constant reminder of the gravity of his office.
And then on the 8th day, the system goes live.
The system goes live. Aaron offers the prescribed sacrifices for himself and for the people. He lifts his hands to bless them. And Scripture says the glory of the Lord appeared to the whole assembly. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and completely consumed the offering on the altar.
It worked. The protocol held. The connection was made.
It worked perfectly, and the people's reaction was just pure awe. They shouted for joy, and they fell face down in worship. It was the ultimate confirmation that God had accepted the system, he had accepted the mediator.
But, and in the Bible, there is always a but when it comes to human nature. We can't stay on the mountaintop forever. We have to talk about the failures. And the essay is very honest about this. Aaron's life is a collection of these glorious highs and just incredibly low lows.
It is, and the most glaring failure, the one we already alluded to, is the golden calf. Now, in the narrative of Exodus, this actually happens before his official ordination, while Moses is up on Mount Sinai getting the law.
Let's try to dig into the psychology of this moment.
Yeah.
Because I think we often just dismiss Aaron as being weak and leave it at that. But the situation on the ground was incredibly intense.
It was a full-blown crisis. Moses has been gone for 40 days. To the ancient mind, if you go up a mountain that's on fire and you don't come back in over a month,
you're dead. He's not coming back.
He's dead. The people are panicked. They're in the middle of a hostile desert. Their leader is gone. Their connection to God seems to be gone. They're terrified.
So they turn on Aaron.
The text says they gather against Aaron. This implies menace, pressure. They demand, make us gods who will go before us. They want two things: a visible replacement for the invisible Moses and a visible representation of the invisible God.
And Aaron, he just folds. But he does something really strange. He doesn't just say, okay, here's a pagan idol like you had in Egypt. He tries to mix it with the worship of Yahweh.
He tries to syncretize it, to blend them. It's a disastrous compromise. He fashions the calf, but then he builds an altar in front of it and proclaims, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord.
So he thinks he can manage the sin.
He thinks he can control it. If I just give them a little visual aid, something tangible, I can keep them from completely going off the rails and maybe keep them pointed towards Yahweh. But he completely and totally underestimates the corrosive evil of idolatry. You can't manage it. It immediately spirals into chaos and debauchery.
And then Moses comes down the mountain. And the excuse Aaron gives is, it's legendary for all the wrong reasons.
It is the sound of a man desperately trying to avoid responsibility. It's pathetic, really. Moses confronts him. What did these people do to you that you brought such great sin upon them?
And Aaron's first move is to blame the people.
Blames the people first. You know the people, that they are set on evil. But then comes the famous line. He says, so I told them, whoever has any gold, let them break it off. So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf.
As if it was some kind of magic trick. A calf just appeared.
He completely minimizes his own agency. The calf came out. He refuses to own the gravity of his action. He took the gold. He fashioned it with a graving tool. He built the altar. But in his shame, he tries to make himself a passive, innocent bystander.
So here's the question that I think every listener struggles with at this point. Why didn't God strike him dead? He led the entire nation into idolatry at the very foot of the mountain of God. He should have been the first one judged.
By all rights, he should have been.
Yeah.
The book of Deuteronomy tells us that Moses interceded passionately for him. But the essay highlights this as a pivotal theological moment. God disciplines the camp. 3,000 men die, there's a plague, there's serious judgment. But God does not discard Aaron's calling. He restores the priesthood.
That is just a staggering amount of mercy.
It is. And think about what that does to Aaron's heart for the rest of his life. The man who is now going to lead the worship of the one true God is the very same man who made the idol. It means he knows, personally and viscerally, the desperate human need for atonement.
He isn't standing there as some perfect example.
Not at all. He's standing there as a man who has been rescued from his own worst failure.
That context makes the tragedy that comes later, in Leviticus chapter 10, even heavier. This is the story of Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's sons.
This is where the gravity of holiness hits home in the most terrifying way imaginable. Aaron's two eldest sons, Nadab and Abihu, who had just been ordained with him, they decide to offer incense in the tabernacle.
But the text says they offered unauthorized fire, sometimes translated as strange fire.
Yes. And we don't know the exact chemical composition or the precise nature of the error. Maybe they took coals from the wrong place. Maybe they used the wrong incense blend. Some traditions suggest they might have been drunk. But the spiritual error is what's crystal clear.
They did it their way, not God's way.
They did it their way. They approached the nuclear reactor casually with their own ideas. They disregarded the clear prescription of God for worship.
And the result was immediate and final.
Fire came out from the presence of the Lord, the same fire that had consumed the acceptable offering, but this time it consumed them. They died right there in the sanctuary.
And Aaron's reaction, as a father, I can't even imagine.
The scripture says, "And Aaron remained silent." It is one of the most chilling and poignant sentences in the entire Bible. Moses comes to him and explains the principle. "Among those who approach me, I will be proved holy." And Aaron, he holds his peace. He accepts the terrible judgment of God.
It's a horrific lesson that zeal, even religious zeal, must be yoked to obedience.
Exactly. You cannot freelance with God's holiness. The closer you are to the fire, the greater the weight of reverence is required.
It really underlines the fact that this job, high priest, it wasn't a perk. It was a terrifying burden.
Absolutely. And that burden, his very right to carry it, was challenged again in the rebellion of Korah. Now, this wasn't Aaron's failure, but a direct challenge to his authority.
Korah basically makes a kind of democratic argument, right?
It sounds very modern, doesn't it? He says, "The whole community is holy, every one of them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?"
We're all equal. We don't need a special mediator.
Exactly. But in saying that, they were ignoring God's specific sovereign appointment. So God settles the debate once and for all with this incredible miracle of life from death. He tells the leaders of each tribe to bring their staff a dead piece of wood.
And they put them in the tent of meeting overnight.
They do. And the next day, Aaron's staff hasn't just sprouted a few leaves. It has budded, it has blossomed, and it has produced ripe almonds.
Life out of dead wood.
It was God's undeniable sign. He was saying, "I choose the priest. This isn't up for a vote. It's about my divine appointment." It confirmed that access to God is on God's terms, not ours.
Okay, so we have to cover one final failure. The one that actually ends his journey just short of the goal, the waters of Meribah.
This is the tragic bookend to his life in the wilderness. It's years later, the people are grumbling about having no water again, and God gives Moses and Aaron a very specific instruction. He tells them to speak to the rock.
Just speak to it, not hit it.
Right, but they're exhausted. They're at the end of their rope with this rebellious generation. They are angry, and Moses, with Aaron standing by him, strikes the rock twice and shouts, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?"
Must we? That's the key phrase, isn't it?
That's the fatal error. They stole God's glory. They made the miracle about their own power and their own frustration rather than God's gracious provision. The text says they failed to uphold God as holy in the eyes of the people.
And the consequence for that one moment of unholiness was they were barred from entering the promised land.
It seems so harsh to us, doesn't it, after everything they'd been through? But it reinforces the high standard of leadership. The more influence you have, the stricter the judgment.
So Aaron's life ends on Mount Hor.
A very quiet, solemn scene. Moses takes Aaron and his son Eleazar up the mountain. And there, in front of the whole congregation, he strips Aaron of the priestly garments, the gift, and he puts them on Eleazar. And Aaron dies there, on the border of the land he would never enter.
The workman dies, but the work of God goes on.
Exactly. A quiet ending to a faithful yet deeply flawed life.
So when we zoom out from the stories and we look at the whole picture, how do we understand the theological role of the high priest? If we had to write a job description based on Aaron's life, what is it?
The core of the job is mediator. That's the #1 role. He stands in the gap between a holy God and a sinful people. He literally wears the names of the 12 tribes on the breastpiece over his heart and on the stones on his shoulders.
He carries the people with him.
He carries them into God's presence symbolically because they cannot go in themselves.
And the essay highlights the Day of Atonement as the ultimate expression of this role.
That is the critical day of the year. Once a year, the high priest goes behind the veil into the most holy place. But notice the crucial limitation, the one that defines the entire Aaronic priesthood. He has to bring blood for himself first.
Why?
The text is explicit. Because he is a sinful man. That's the glass ceiling of the whole system. The mediator was one of them. He was infected with the same disease he was trying to treat.
It's like a doctor who is dying of the same plague as his patients. He can offer some temporary relief, but he can't provide the ultimate cure.
That is a perfect analogy. And this brings us to the ultimate point, the so what for the Christian listener today. Aaron is a shadow. He's a sketch. He's a pointer.
A sketch of Jesus.
Yes, the book of Hebrews picks up this exact theme and just runs with it. It argues that the blood of bulls and goats under the old system could provide a temporary covering for sin. It was like paying the minimum balance on your credit card each month.
You stay current, but the debt is still there.
The massive debt remains. It could never clear the conscience or truly take sin away permanently.
But Jesus does something completely different.
Jesus is the better Aaron. He's the perfect high priest. He doesn't offer the blood of an animal. He offers himself. And because he is sinless, he doesn't need to offer a sacrifice for his own sin first. He enters the true heavenly sanctuary, not an earthly tent, and he deals with our sin debt once and for all.
That distinction is so comforting because it means we have a high priest who sympathizes with our weakness but doesn't share in our failure.
That is the beautiful balance that the book of Hebrews strikes. It says, we have a high priest who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, so. He understands the struggle intimately, yet he was without sin. Aaron understood the struggle because he failed at it. Jesus understands the struggle because he fought it and won.
Now, the essay includes a specific note on Israel and the church that I think is important to touch on carefully. It mentions a dispensational reading. For the listener at home, what is the author getting at with that?
It's a nuanced but important theological point. The author is basically arguing that while the church today acts as a spiritual priesthood, meaning all believers have direct access to God through Christ, this doesn't cancel out or erase God's specific historic promises to the nation of Israel.
So it's saying God isn't done with the Jewish people as a nation.
Correct. The essay points to prophecies in books like Ezekiel and Zechariah that describe a future literal temple and a future literal priesthood, specifically from the line of the sons of Zadok in the coming kingdom age.
And why is that important for us to know?
The point is to honor God's faithfulness to his word. If God keeps his very specific promises to Israel, then we can have full confidence that he will keep his very specific promises to the church. It's about the unchanging integrity of God's character.
That's helpful context. It reminds us that the Bible is one big story with a very long timeline.
Exactly.
Okay, let's try to land this plane with some practical application. We aren't high priests. We don't have staffs that bud almonds. But what do we take away from Aaron's life for our own walk with God today?
I think the first and maybe most obvious lesson goes right back to that image at Rephidim. Shared gifts and interdependence.
Moses and Aaron needing each other to win the battle.
Yes. In the body of Christ, the idea of the Lone Ranger Christian is a myth. It just doesn't work. We have this cultural tendency to idolize self-sufficiency. But the biblical model is that sometimes you are Moses with your hands raised, fighting the spiritual battle. And sometimes you're Aaron. You're the one sitting on a rock while someone else holds your weary hands up for you.
That is such a relief to hear, honestly, to know that if my hands are heavy, it's not a sin to need support.
It's not a sin, it's the design. We need the mouth and the hand. We need the visionary and the supporter. We need each other.
Okay, what about the lesson on worship? We
Right.
spent a lot of time on the golden calf. That feels like a major warning.
It is a severe warning. The golden calf was an attempt to make worship user-friendly. They wanted a God they could see, a festival they could enjoy on their own terms. It was. It was consumer-driven religion.
And Aaron, as the leader, gave the customer what they wanted.
He did. And the essay warns leaders specifically about this. Do not bend to the tide of opinion. It is so tempting to reshape the church or theology, to soothe a restless crowd or to try and be relevant. But a leader's primary job is to point people to the invisible, holy God, even when the people are clamoring for a golden calf.
So true worship isn't about our creative zeal or what feels good.
It's about God's prescription. It's about holiness.
That's a hard word, but a necessary one.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to end on a note of hope. We talked about Aaron's failure, but also his restoration.
This, for me, is the most beautiful part of Aaron's story. If you're listening right now and you feel disqualified, maybe you failed publicly, maybe you feel like you've made a calf in your own life, look at Aaron.
God didn't fire him. He didn't discard him.
God disciplined him, yes, there were consequences, absolutely. But God restored him. He washed him, put the robes back on him, and said, in essence, get back to work. The very hands that shaped the gold into an idol were the same hands that were later lifted to bless the people of God.
That is profound.
It means God's grace is bigger than our biggest failures. He uses imperfect servants. In fact, he only has imperfect servants to work with.
And speaking of those hands blessing the people, we can't do a deep dive on Aaron without reading the Aaronic blessing from number 6.
It's one of the great treasures of Scripture. God gave Aaron and his sons these specific words to speak over the people, and they are beautiful. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace.
And the essay reminds us this isn't just for ancient priests.
No. In Christ, all believers are a kingdom of priests. We can pray this blessing over our children, over our homes, over our friends. The text says it is literally placing God's name upon his people. It's claiming his protection and his favor, the light of his face shining upon us.
So as we wrap up this whole conversation, Aaron the Levite, gift and gravity.
He was a man of dust who was called to carry the weight of glory. He helped pull an entire nation out of slavery. He stumbled, he sinned terribly, he stayed silent in his grief. He teaches us what a mediator looks like in all his flawed humanity, so that when the true mediator arrived, we would recognize him.
He set the stage for Jesus.
He set the stage, and I think the only way to end this is to look at the invitation that Aaron's entire life points toward. The essay closes with a passage from Hebrews chapter 4 that just sums it all up.
Let's read it. It says, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin."
And here's the invitation that flows from that truth. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need.
That one word changes everything. Confidence. Because of Jesus, we don't approach with terror like the Israelites at the foot of the mountain. We approach with confidence. So, to you listening right now, may you go today with that confidence, not in your own strength, and certainly not in your own perfection, but in the finished work of Jesus, our great high priest. May you approach the throne of grace boldly, knowing that you are loved, knowing you are understood, and knowing that you will find help in your time of need. Grace and peace be with you.